Hello everybody. I just wanted to make one more video concerning our grant writing process, and in this one in particular I want to talk about the IRB and our particular proposal. But I feel like there might be a little bit of confusion out there about the different levels of IRB review board kind of thing. So I want to talk about those and make sure that we all know the difference. So there are normally, at least at our university, and I've seen it at a couple of other locations, 3 different levels of review, basically. One is the exempt level. So, and a couple of you thought that our grant might be exempt, so I want to make sure we understand this. Exempt means that you do not have to go through the process. Have to be examined, basically. Normally to get exempt exempt status, they ask you a bunch of questions. I'll run through that with you in a minute. They ask you a bunch of questions, and if you fall into the category where, for instance, I've done a couple of things where we've been exempted where we were studying student records. Okay, so if a student took a class 5 years ago, and now I want to go back and see, oh, did they do better with this technique or that technique? Well, this technique was in section 3 and that technique was in section 5. And all I want to do is look at grades in section 3.3 versus 5. And then gather student information like maybe their demographics and stuff like that, ethnicity, sex, gender, those kinds of things. Then that's considered student records. In other words, I'm just looking at stuff that's already there. I'm not going in and doing any kind of intervention with students live, so to speak. It's all retrospective. It's all looking in the past. And I don't really need to interact with students. I'm not doing focus groups or anything like that. So if that's the case, then normally that kind of research would be exempt because I'm just looking at their records, okay? I'm not really involving them in any way, and I can't affect their grade in the class right now because this happened 5 years ago. Those kinds of things. Normally I would be expected to make sure, they'll make a big deal out of, make sure that all the records are not related to any one student. They'll call it aggregate your data or disaggregate your data. So whenever you do that, basically what they're wanting to do is to split it off from any particular student. So I can say, for instance, 20 out of the 30 students were female. I can say that, and that doesn't point to Susie Q. But if I say there was one white female who was age 32 who had 5 children, then I'm getting pretty specific. And even if I don't use Susie Q's name, other people who were around her might know that it was Susie Q. Okay, so I have to code things and make sure that these people are not identifiable. Okay, remove any identifiable markers. So if we say 20 out of 30 were women, well, then that's just women in general. And then if I then turn around and say the average grade for the women was a B, then that's fine, right? But if I say Susie Q made a B, then I'm in trouble. So anyway, a lot of times if I'm dealing with student records, I'm okay. If I'm dealing with something that's like curriculum development, it's okay because that's not dealing with actually putting our curriculum in with the students. Now what we're talking about for our grant is we're talking about actually not only developing the curriculum but then putting it into place and seeing how this does with the students, right? We're talking about actually taking them and doing stuff with them. So that's an intervention with people. So probably ours isn't exempt, but we're going to look in a second. And a couple of you mentioned they're minors. We're not exempt. They're going to want to watch us like a hawk when we're working with minors, and you're right about that, okay? So that's one version. The other version is expedited, Okay, so how it normally works is whenever you submit your IRB form there's going to be a drop box or whatever where you put it in, one or two people are assigned to look at these things. And if they look at it, you filled out the exempt form, and they look at it and they go, yeah, I think it's exempt, then normally they'll share it with one or two colleagues, and they'll be like, yeah, it's exempt, and they'll just move it on down the thing. Sometimes, like in the summertime, the chair might be the person looking at that, the chair of the committee, and she might just go, it's a woman right now, she might just go, oh, this is exempt, no problem, and she'll just send it back to you, check, check, exempt, go away. Okay, come in, and a lot of times when it's exempt, they'll give you like a 3-year thing on it and say, okay, come see us in 3 years if you're still working on this, because we're okay with it. So exempt, if you are exempt, is the best way because you don't have to go through a lot of rigmarole. Expedited. Expedited is you have to be reviewed, but it can be a committee, basically. But just a small group, basically, of your peers. That's what normally happens, happens with expedited. And so the idea here is, well, we don't think that you're exempt. We still want to make sure, we want to talk to you about our consent forms. We want to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. We want to make sure of all the processes you're doing. We're going to watch you, and normally in an expedited thing, they might give you a 1 to 2 year approval, but it's not just going to be ignored, okay, like it would be for exempt. So it's expedited because they would say this is almost no risk up here. They'll never say no risk, okay, but they'll say almost no risk. This one would be low risk, okay. So for instance, I had one that was expedited, the grant that I'm working on right now. We said we were going to do focus groups with our students, but they're all adult students. We put different process into place in their classes, but it's not like it's a type of teaching process. So it doesn't matter if they participate or not. If they're in the class, they're getting that particular intervention. So then we wanted to know how they liked it, if it helped, blah, blah, blah. So then we were doing focus groups, which is low risk, okay. We're doubtful to scar somebody psychologically by asking them their opinion of how they felt about the class and if they liked the projects and this and that. But even though that seems like, oh, it's not a big deal, I still had to jump through a lot of hoops. I still had to deal with the consent form. I still had to reword some of the questions that we were going to ask them in the focus groups and stuff like that. And they had to approve. Okay, so there's a lot more approval going on. They had to approve the consent form. They had to approve my focus group questions. I had a girl, she did a really cool undergraduate honors thesis, and it was integrating math and dance. I might have mentioned it before, but anyway, integrating math and dance. And what she wanted to do was get some of her people that she'd worked with in a dance school, like students, but they weren't necessarily her students. But she wanted these kids to work out some of the dance moves for her and to demonstrate it so she could record it and then play it for her class. And she had to get special approval. It didn't go full board, but it did have to go expedited. She had to get extra stuff because she had some kids that were dancing, and you have to be careful about that. Make sure you got the parents on board and all that kind of stuff. Now, the parents loved it. The kids loved doing the dance. There was no big deal at all about it, but the protection of the human subjects comes in play, and that's what the IRB does, right? They make sure that everything's in place, and that at any time if one of those students wanted to say, hey, I don't want to do this dance thing anymore, they could have walked away and she would have let them. So that's what they're trying to make sure of. So yeah, she was expedited. The one that I'm doing right now is expedited. Even though I felt like it should probably be exempt, yeah, they didn't do what I wanted them to do. And then the last type that we have here at A&M Commerce, and most places run about the same that I've seen, is the full board. Now, the full board is actually going to take longer. So the exempt My experience is I normally get approval back for the exempt within a week or 2 weeks. The expedited, a lot of times it takes 2 weeks to a month to get stuff back. But the full board, that's going to take a while because the board only meets normally once a month. Okay. And there are deadlines. So, for instance, if they're going to meet on the 15th of this month, then they probably want everything in by the 1st of the month so that they can review it. Everybody can have a chance to look at it before they meet. Okay. And if it's a full board, then they automatically know there's a higher risk involved. Okay. So if they know that there's a higher risk involved, they want to really make sure everything's okay. This probably isn't ours. Ours is our current one, I would bet, would be in the expedited, but not necessarily because we're taking these kids places. So they may not want it to be expedited. They might want to actually look at our activities, make sure we've really got enough chaperones and stuff like that. But normally I consider full board more like if we were going to do some psychological tests on these people, trying to see how they responded to certain stimuli or something like that. That's a little higher risk for that person who's participating in our study, right? Then we're going to go to Six Flags, yay. Okay, so if we were doing some kind of medical, psychological, those kinds of things, to me really, oops, I can't spell psychological. Those kinds of things really would warrant more of a full board review. And it's just about the higher risk. So they want to make sure they're covering you. They're covering if you've got an advisor who is helping you with your study. They're covering that person, the faculty member at the university who's helping you run your master's thesis or research paper, and they're covering the university, right? And most importantly, they're making sure that whoever this person is that you're doing psychological testing on, that they're not being abused in any way, because that's really, really important. So those are the basic three. Okay, so I just want to look real quickly, and we're not going to go through this whole thing. You have the links to the IRBs. I'm going to show you. This is the exempt form application, okay, and I've done this one lots of times. Notice the exempt application is still 7 pages long. Okay, so just because you're doing exempt does not mean that it's going to be a piece of cake. It is nice, the current form that they've got is like a fillable PDF type thing. So all of this stuff, you have the document in front of you and you can click it on your thing. The title of the study, you can type this in and save it into the document, which is really, really super nice. Whenever I went through and was doing my dissertation, we were still having to print forms and handwrite on them. So this is so much nicer. So let me see if I can get this zoomed in so we can read it a little bit. Okay, so first thing, this is how you fill it out and save it. Okay, fine. Second thing, does this form apply to you? So this is the exempt review. So this is why I think you would realize that our study is not, our grant is not going to be this. So look at question number 1. Will your research study involve any vulnerable populations such as children, prisoners, and individuals with impaired decision-making abilities? Now, we talked about this once in our ethical stuff that we were looking at. You guys mentioned it in some of your discussions of the Nazis and things like that. You're not allowed to do research on children, prisoners, people with impaired decision-making abilities. That could be either some form of mental retardation, or it could be somebody who has had brain trauma from an accident, or maybe they've done drugs and caused brain damage, those kinds of things. Anything that would impair their ability to understand what's going on, they're a vulnerable population. In other words, that means they're probably not allowed to give consent for themselves. Okay, so you got to watch out for that. Okay, so we would say yes because we're dealing with children. Okay, now I'm just going to say just because we're dealing with minors, it automatically knocks us out of this exempt. But let's see what else are things that might knock us out of being exempt. Could public disclosure of any identifiable data you collect place the participants at risk of criminal or civil liability or be damaging to the participant's financial standing, employment, or reputation. So this means, are we going to be disclosing, for instance, that this person's done drugs? Okay, that's the one that immediately comes to my mind. If we're in psychology and we're looking at people who have caused some brain damage based on drugs, and they're going to disclose to us that they did drugs, they could get arrested for that, they might lose their job, that kind of thing. Well, guess what? That automatically knocks you out of exempt, okay? Because that is a very potential risk for these people. We in math probably aren't going to deal with that, but, you know, depending on where you are in the university, psychology in particular, social work, things like that, sociology, those more humanities-based groups, they tend to do more of that kind of stuff, and so they tend to not be able to be doing the exempt as much as, say, an education study that's just looking at records, okay? Will your study involve data collection procedures other than surveys, educational tests, interviews, or observation of public behavior? Okay, so are you collecting data that it's anything other than surveys, educational tests, interviews, or observation of public data? Ours really isn't. We had focus groups in there, but I consider those under interviews for the most part. So again, we're not number 2, we're not number 3, but number 1 already knocked us out. Will your study involve any sensitive subject matters such as abortion, criminal activity, sexual activity, sexually transmitted diseases, any prior diagnosis of mental health disorders or victims of violence? Okay, so this would be like my counseling department where maybe they're doing family counseling, so they're worried about domestic violence. So if they're doing a study that might expose any of these things, I mean, we might say, oh, well, the person did that and they're willing to talk about it, so it's not much risk to them. But the idea is if that information becomes public, then it would be a risk to that person. So we have to be careful of what we're doing. Again, not likely that we'll do that in math, but counselors and I keep on picking on psychology, but they tend to do some of those more risky studies, so got to watch out for that. Will your study involve audio recording or video recording the participants? So if you record at all, which I don't know that we said we were going to. Well, somebody, I think Brittany might have said it would be nice if we could have a GoPro camera at Six Flags so that they could record their experiences and stuff like that. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. And if we could collect some data off of that and you thought that that would be a really good use of our money for grants to spend on that, I say go for it, but just realize it will knock you out of the exempt category, okay? Which is not that big of a deal. It just slows down your process, okay? You're still going to have to do consent forms. You're still going to make sure you're keeping people's data separate from their names so they're not identifiable and stuff like that. But and these videos, we're probably going to have to encrypt them. We're probably going to have to save them under lock and key kind of thing. And by the way, they do have a process where, for instance, right now under my grant, I'm just doing focus groups and interviews. It was exempt. No, was it exempt? Expedited. So it was an expedited study, but I was just doing focus groups and that kind of stuff. But they came to my office, they checked my encryption, they made sure that I had a safe available to put a lockbox basically where I can put things, student records, and that I'm the only one who has a key to that. And so they really are very serious about that, and they call it basically an internal audit where they're doing that. And last one, will your study involve obtaining individually identifiable information from healthcare plans, healthcare clearinghouses, or healthcare providers? Again, this isn't us. This is more of a medical thing or a mental thing, a physiology thing, something like that. But if you were at, say, Johns Hopkins Hospital, which also has a university involved with it, and you wanted to look at, say, cancer patients and whether or not this particular medicine is helping, then you're going to be dealing with healthcare providers and healthcare plans. And so they want to know that because all of that HIPAA information is very vulnerable information. And if you go and tell somebody, hey, that person has cancer, or even if you don't tell them, if you happen to have their records sitting on your desk and somebody walks in and sees, oh, Joe Schmo there, he has prostate cancer, then it's going to be a problem because that means that you just let sensitive data be exposed to the public, right? So if you're going to do any of those things, again, they're going to really make sure that you're encrypting your data and locking it up and stuff like that. All right, and then we see if you answered yes to any of the above questions, your study will not meet the criteria of the exempt review. Please fill out the expedited or full board application for your study. So this one is not going to work for us. The forms are actually very, very similar. So for instance, you see number 1 down here is the title of the study, number 2 is the investigator, and when I flip over to the other form, it's going to start the same way. It just doesn't have all those questions at the beginning because exempt is the only one where they go, okay, if it doesn't have any of this, then we'll throw you into the fast track, basically. So unfortunately, number 1 knocked us right out of our thing because we're dealing with children and we are not going to be able to do exempt at all. Which we talked about that a little bit in the discussions, right? So instead, we would want to fill out the expedited or full board review. Interestingly, notice it's also 7 pages, okay? So it's not that the exempt one is a shorter process, it's just that the time, if you think you're exempt and they agree, the time to approval is faster. That's the only reason why you might want to go that way. All right, so again, they tell me how to fill out the form: title, investigator, full name, email address, the department you're with. If you have co-investigators, for instance, if we wrote this grant and I had a co-PI on it, say Dr. Davis over in the planetarium, then I would have to put her information on it. And both of us, anybody who's involved in this, has to be up to date on all that training that we talked about, the city training, the human subject stuff, all of that. If I have a student, like my honor student who did the dance study, or I have a student right now who's a master's student who's wanting to write a paper on math history. Now that one will be a historical study and we're not going to deal with human subjects, but if they decided to do something with human subjects, we'd have to run an IRB, and at that point, before we submit, everybody who's on the study as a named person, that would be the person writing the paper plus me, because I'm the advisor, we all have to be up to date on our training, or else they won't let it go through until you have finished that. Okay. Additional personnel. In general, I would leave this blank because I don't want them to go check that all of the faculty members who we got for key personnel are, whether or not they're possibly in there. We'll deal with that later, make sure that they've got all their training, but for the purposes of doing the IRB, I just want to make sure that all of us that are on it as investigators are listed. And see, they're looking, look here, have all your personnel completed the city IRB training, human subjects research and responsible conduct of research. Okay, so, and you have to, they don't trust you to say yes, you have to touch the completion certificates, which I think is kind of funny, but people lie, so, have to do that. Okay, after that, there's a whole bunch of other questions. Funding information, oops, I'm in the wrong spot. There we go. Funding information for us, that would be, yes, we're applying to an external grant. Has external or internal been proposed or awarded for this project? And if yes, please submit the statement of work or a project summary and provide your project number that you put it through. So they want to know, oh, what did you tell NSF that you're going to do? So that's there. Just the purpose of the study, that's a brief thing. Somewhere in our overall program description to NSF, that's going to be there. So basically, we can cut and paste some of this stuff. Any previous research that we've done, well, we haven't with this particular group, so we can ignore that. How are you going to recruit the participants? Now, this is what they're going to pay the most attention to on us especially considering that we're dealing with students, okay? Describe the projected number of people, population from which the subjects will be recruited, what kind of gender are we after, what ethnicity, what age range. So this information they're going to want to know. Okay, how will you recruit them? Face-to-face, email, flyer, and classroom announcement. And look, they want us to already have our recruitment materials put together. So if we say we're going to send them, give them out a flyer in class, then hey, we need to know that. If you say that you're going to have a classroom announcement in your classes, that's great. You need a script for that. So according to the IRB, they want to make sure that every teacher who's making this classroom announcement makes the same classroom announcement. So we want a script. Now, they don't have to read it word for word necessarily. Of course, the IRB will tell you they should, but they need to be really close to what it says on that script, okay? Vulnerable populations. Here's the important part. We have a vulnerable population, children under 18 years of age, and because of that, if any of these boxes are checked, describe any special precautions you're going to take in your study because you're including these populations. So how are we going to protect them? And it seems to us like, duh, they're not threatened, they're not at risk, but they are. Just from being involved in a study, they could get hurt. So what are the risks and what are we doing to protect them? Like we're having multiple chaperones, okay? That's one of the things we're doing. So location of the study, where are we going to have them meet? Data collection sites other than TAMUC. So what that means is if we were collecting data in the public schools, if we were making them do pre-test or post-test there, probably we'd do it in our workshops and on a Saturday or an after-school thing or whatever. But if we are, then we need to attach a signed and dated letterhead from that school district that says it's okay for us to go in there and collect that data, okay? Which means your principal and possibly your superintendent need to know that you are involved in this study, okay? And you are involving their students in this study. So everybody needs to be in on the loop so that we are not messing anything up. And then they've got information about informed consent forms and very detailed stuff about what it's going to look like. They want to see it. It's not enough to say that you did it. They want your draft, okay? So there you go. That's page 4. I'm going to run through the rest of this real quickly, just so we can see it. Are you using any languages other than English? If so, then tell us what that looks like. Like we're going to want to see the translation into Spanish if you think you need to give it to them in Spanish, especially if you're dealing with young Hispanic kids and you think that their parents might not read English when you send that consent form home, then you might think about, oh, we need to translate this into Spanish, right? And I know that was one of our underrepresented populations, so we may need to think about that. How are we going to get that translated and what's it going to look like? Probably we wouldn't need, say, French or Russian or anything like that, but in Texas for our grant, we might need our consent form to be in all of the materials. Like if we're sending home to the parents saying, hey, look, next Saturday we're going to Six Flags, then if we know we have a population of Hispanic students, we might need that in both English and Spanish because the parents in particular sometimes don't read English. The kids in high school probably do, but the parents may not. Here's your methods for data collection. Which method are you using? Please check all that apply. Review of existing records and/or observations are checked above. Please describe below the records you plan to review and/or the observations you plan to make. So it's not enough to just say we're going to do this. They want to know. Will you involve audio recording? Will you involve video recording? Have you attached a copy of all data collection instruments? So if you're planning to do some kind of a focus group thing, this is where you got to give them the questions. This is where you have to give them, see, the interview scripts, right? Topics for the focus group, all that stuff. Estimated time for a subject's participation in each study activity. So if we're thinking the workshops are going to be 2 or 3 hours, and the field trips are going to be all day, then we need to tell them this is what we're doing in each one. Compensation. Do you plan to pay your participants? Okay. Now the students were saying no, absolutely not. We're not giving them anything. But the teachers, we might say, oh, the teachers, we are going to give them, I don't know, $100 to come for our professional development or something like that. So if we are, then we have to list that. Risks and benefits, and again, they are not going to accept, there's no risk to the student. So in y'all's discussion boards, some of you listed out some pretty good risks. Okay, this, oh, we have to worry about this. Oh, we have to worry about that. That's right. Now, it also says the anticipated benefits, and of course, you need to list that and talk it up, because what are they doing here? They are going to look and see what the risks are and see what the benefits are, and if they don't feel like the benefits outweigh the risks, then they're going to say, no, you can't do this study on our campus. So we want to make sure that the benefits far outweigh that. Confidentiality, what procedures are you going to do to make sure their personally identifiable data cannot be identified? Please specify where your research records are going to be held. So how are you going to secure that stuff? I mentioned that earlier. Are you planning to publish your results? If you are, where, how, what are you planning to do? Academic journals. We might want to do that after we have some results saying that our students did better in physics than other students, right? So we might want to write a journal. So if we're thinking we will to disseminate the results of our study, then boom, we need to check that and let them know, yeah, we think we're going to do that. If you're doing a thesis or a dissertation, then yeah, we need to put that in there. Okay. And then this is just certification that you've done all the stuff that you should do by checking this box and emailing this application. I am certifying that the information in this application is complete and true. Okay, complete and accurate. All right, and then they give you a list of stuff to do. So that's just a fast run through of what that looks like. And it's not terrible. It really is not horrible. That's the expedited or full board. By the way, you don't get to pick which one of those it is. You fill out this form and you submit it. And like I said, the chair or somebody will look at it. They'll share it with a small group of their colleagues. If the small group says, oh, we're going to expedite this, it might take a few weeks, maybe a month. Okay, they'll send that back to you, you're done. But if they look at it and they say, ooh, they're wanting to do psychological experiments on prisoners in a federal penitentiary, then that's going full board, and they will send that out. You don't choose. They'll let you know, oh, yours has been chosen for full board review, and we'll let you know whenever you get approval or if you need to do something else. And almost always they want to tweak something. It seems like they feel like they have to tweak stuff. They can't just say, oh, well done, good job, get out of here. Even if you're exempt, they might say, oh, we want you to change this wording in the consent form or whatever. And I've just over the years figured out, oh, just do it and move on, because it doesn't matter to me whether I say there's minimal risks or there's no low risks. You know, if they want me to say minimal instead of low, I'll say minimal and move on, right? So I'm not going to argue with them, because they're the ones that are holding up my study. They're the ones holding up my ability to move on and do this grant work that we want to do. So, yeah, I'm going to make sure to just make the corrections that they want and move on, right? Okay, that's my plan at least. Okay, so my guess is that for ours, that a group of them would probably look at it. It's not exempt because we're working with kids, right? So that one's out. But I would bet that a small group of them will look at it, and they, as long as we dot our I's and cross our T's and explain the benefits and let them know that we've thought about risks and we're planning these things out, and the schools have insurance on their bus drivers, or, you know, whatever it is that they think the risks might be. And we have addressed all of those things, and we've got our consent form in place and all that. My guess is that they would expedite it, that small group would look at it and go, yeah, the benefit outweighs the risk. We think it's low risk, so we'll let them go. But you never know. With children involved, it's possible they could go, we really need the whole board to look at this. And what happens is, that doesn't mean anything bad is going on or whatever. It doesn't mean we're doing crazy experiments with our kids. What it means is they just want to have everybody there look at it and make sure everybody's on board. Maybe because every department on campus has somebody that represents on the IRB normally, as long as their seats aren't empty for whatever reason, somebody left or whatever. So, for instance, there's somebody from math who sits on that board. There's somebody from education who sits on that board. So maybe they want somebody from education to explain something about the curriculum for physics. I don't know. Maybe they want somebody from math to explain how the math ties to the physics. How is this all working together? Why bother going to Six Flags? Why bother going to NASA? Why doing iFly? So why bother doing all that? So maybe somebody from kinesiology can explain to them how you tie the physical activity to the mental thing, and that helps out the students to learn faster and better. So maybe they just want to discuss it, but maybe they want everybody to say, yep, it's okay, because they're worried a little bit because it's children under 18, and they're like, we just need everybody to sign off on this, basically. So it could go full board. My bet is it would be expedited, but either way, we would submit it with plenty of time to make sure that we can still do our study. So there you go. That's my bit on IRB. I was not planning to do a quiz over this particular video, but I hope that you have watched it and gotten something good out of this, because out of all of the processes that we talk about in the ethical thing, IRB is probably the one you're most likely to run into in your educational careers. So I hope this helps, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you. Bye.